Today, we're going to explore a concept called cultural calibration. It's all about how organizations are using AI to make sure their unique values are actually reflecting in the day-to-day actions of their supervisors. We're going to look at how this really moves beyond those generic leadership courses to build a company culture that's consistent and truly authentic. So, here's how we'll break it down. First, we'll tackle the main problem, why generic models just create inconsistency. Then, we'll define what we mean by cultural calibration. After that, we'll get into how AI acts as the infrastructure to make it all work, how values get embedded in the workflow, the risks of not doing this, and finally, what it all means for distributed teams. All right, let's start with the fundamental problem. The issue with most traditional leadership models is, simply put, behavioral inconsistency. You end up with this huge gap between the ideal behaviors you teach in a training session and what leaders actually do at work. And just how big is that gap? Well, it's pretty staggering. Research from Harvard Business Review found that only about 12% of the skills learned in leadership training ever actually get applied on the job. Think about that. That means a whopping 88% of that investment is just gone. This slide really illustrates that disconnect. You can see the comparison here. On the left, you have the intent of training, which is knowledge transfer. Simple enough. But on the right, you see the operational reality, something called behavioral drift. Over time, leaders just slowly drift away from the standards they were taught. And this phenomenon has a name: execution drift. We're talking about that slow, often unconscious deviation from the standards you want. And it's really important to see this not as an individual failing, but as a systemic one. It's caused by a lack of reinforcement in the daily routine. So, if execution drift is the problem, what's the solution? Well, it lies in a strategy called cultural calibration. This is all about tightly aligning a leader's behavior with the organization's unique identity. So, what exactly is cultural calibration? You can think of it as the process of training an AI model on a company's specific cultural DNA, its unique values, its behavioral standards, its norms. The whole point is to make sure that any guidance or reinforcement the system gives is perfectly aligned with that identity. You know, this really represents a fundamental shift in thinking. We're moving away from generic one-size-fits-all best practices and replacing them with behavioral standards that are actually specific and authentic to that one organization. Okay, but how do you deliver this kind of calibration across an entire organization? That brings us to our next section, looking at AI as the reinforcement infrastructure that actually builds that behavioral consistency. What you're seeing here is the leadership execution model, which really shows how consistency can be engineered by design. Let's walk through it from left to right. On the far left, you see the problem we've been talking about. Training knowledge decays, and that leads to execution drift. The solution is in the center, a leadership execution system. It uses AI to provide guidance right in the flow of work, and the system is designed to produce the outcome you see on the right: aligned performance and a consistent culture. So how does this actually play out day to day? Well, the AI reinforcement works in 4 key steps. First, it delivers real-time prompts right when they're needed. Second, it gives that reinforcement directly in the flow of work. Third, it helps guide decisions to make sure they're culturally aligned. And fourth, it creates these daily execution loops that are crucial for building and sustaining good habits. It's this kind of infrastructure that makes it possible to truly embed your company's values right into a supervisor's daily workflow. This is a big move away from those one-off, episodic training events and towards a model of continuous, day-to-day execution. This comparison really highlights the difference. On the left side, you see traditional training. That happens in a classroom or a virtual session, totally separate from daily work. But on the right, you see the leadership execution system, which operates directly inside the supervisor's workflow, right where the real decisions get made. And because it operates inside the workflow, the system enables a whole set of competencies that traditional training just can't touch. You're building practical skills in things like cultural alignment, drift prevention, and reinforcement mastery, all while creating a consistent daily rhythm. So what happens when these systems aren't calibrated? Let's take a look at the very real risks and the operational consequences that come from all this inconsistency. When leadership is uncalibrated, it leads to some very predictable failures. You start to see cultural drift, you get inconsistent norms across different teams, and that creates variation in quality, it increases compliance risks, and it leads to a lot more avoidable escalations for the organization. This really brings us back to the core idea. Drift isn't something that happens in a bad environment. It's an inevitable result of human nature, of how our habits decay, and what happens when you don't have a system for daily reinforcement. So, what does this all mean for the way we work now? Let's focus on the unique challenges facing distributed and remote teams, and how a systemic approach like this can scale that much-needed consistency no matter the distance. The thing is, in a distributed work environment, you don't have those informal, in-person moments that can help keep people aligned. Physical distance naturally acts as an amplifier for behavioral inconsistencies and actually makes that drift happen faster. A leadership execution system, however, is basically designed to solve this exact problem. It standardizes guidance and automates that reinforcement across every location. This ensures the cultural messages are always consistent and gives you clear visibility into leadership execution no matter where your people are. This all leaves us with a final and pretty critical question to think about. Is the problem of leadership inconsistency really an individual skills gap, or is it something more fundamental, a failure in the very design of our organizational systems? The underlying research for this analysis is recorded in the following publications: DOI 10.5281/Zenodo1739416, DOI 10.5281/Zenodo1742556, Orchid 0009-0004-6525-5634. Published by the Leadership Execution Institute.